All right, so we're live. Here we are, the final chapter. How exciting, eh? Chapter 14 in this 14-part series I just read. Before I finish, I was going to say, before I start, I was going to say, I don't know, I like to read, and I try to read lots as much as I can, but I know for some people it's hard, to get through a book. Damn dogs and these bones, man. They like to chew these bones. But yeah, it takes a bit of perseverance to get through a book. And so it always feels like an accomplishment to me, too, to finish a book, and especially one that's got some heft to it. It is like setting a goal. And I would encourage everybody to read. Anyways, let's finish this because I want to bash on with my next book, which is J. Dobbins' No Angel. I'm going to pick that one apart a bit. But here we are, chapter 14, page 257 of Kevin Weeks's riveting untold story of his life inside Whitey Bulger's Irish mob, entitled Brutal. And it has been brutal. So this chapter is entitled Arrest, Prison, and Release. On November 17th, 1999, around 3 in the afternoon, I was walking down N and 6th Streets, heading to my car to go down to the variety store when agents from the DEA and state police called out, "Kevin." "Yeah," I said. "Have you got a minute?" One of them said, "We want to talk to you." "I'm heading down to the store to get a cup of coffee," I told him. "I'll meet you down there." "No, we want to talk to you here," the agent said. I could see other agents in cars around the street, and as well as some walking around. They were all over the place. "Am I under arrest?" "No," he said. "Then I'll meet you down at the store," I said. As I started to walk away, he got on the radio and talked to someone else. Then he turned around and called out my name again. This time he said, "Kevin, you're under arrest." Gig is up. When he handcuffed me, he asked me if I had any weapons. "I have a knife in my back pocket," I told him. "Thanks," he said, and reached in and took it out. Two agents from the DEA and State Police Task Force then put me in a car as other official cars drove by. A few minutes later, Dan Doherty from the DEA and Tom Duffy from the State Police, acting as professionally as the other two agents, took me out of that car and put me in the back seat of their car. They drove me over to the DEA headquarters in a building over by City Hall, where they seated me in a room. It wasn't a surprise that I was being arrested. The night before, on November 16th, I had been at the Teamsters pub for a billiards league. When I came out of the building with a friend of mine, we got in my car on 3rd Street. I took a left on D Street and was driving up D Street when a van came through the lot where the gas station was. I could see that the driver of the van was burning me, looking at me hard. Immediately, I recognized him as Dave Lazarus from the IRS. He had been all over town lately, asking questions about me and giving everybody he talked to his card. He drove down the street behind me and I saw him making a U-turn. I had my scanner on and could hear him and a fellow agents talking about me. Then I spotted two or three other cars all converge and began to follow me. At the same time, I had two pistols on me. After I ran the red light through the intersection on Broadway, I took a left on 4th Street, floored the car, and without stopping the traffic, headed across Dorchester Street. As I took a right onto G Street, I could hear them saying on the police scanner that they had lost me. I went down the street and dropped off the friend who was with me, handing him the two pistols I had on me. He jumped into his car and took off with no problem. They weren't following him, they were following me. Later on, I parked my car and walked back to the house. That was it for the night. When I came out of my house the next afternoon, they were waiting at the DEA headquarters. Oh, yeah, at the DEA headquarters. They gave me the 29 count indictment that also didn't surprise me. I had heard that they had grabbed Kevin Hayes and they were trying to get him to cooperate against me. I had talked to a friend of mine who knew Hayes well and had told me, "Don't worry, he'll never cooperate. He'll never say a thing." "Are you sure?" I had asked my friend, "because this guy can put me away." I was prepared to take Hayes out, but my friend told me he was friends with Hayes's wife. "Don't worry," my friend said again. "He'll never say a word against you." It turned out that Kevin Hayes did give the DEA and the state police a predicate act in the last 5 years, meaning he told them about a criminal act that occurred in the last 5 years, with which they were able to indict me on a RICO charge. They said I had kidnapped Hayes, which was not true. He had come in of his own will. Besides, the guy weighed 400 pounds. There was no way I could have kidnapped him. Hayes also told them that they had been two igloo coolers in the room, the kind you use for sandwiches and cold drinks, and that I was going to put him in the coolers after I chopped him up. If I had ever chopped up his 400-pound body, I would have never needed a freezer truck for all the pieces. I was kept at DEA headquarters for about 3 hours. At first, the agents tried to make a deal with me, telling me, "Kevin, you don't have to go away. You can work with us." "You have nothing," I told them. Finally, they said, "Bring in the other guy," and brought in Kevin O'Neill. I had heard all along that they were going to indict me and Kevin, but I felt bad for Kevin. He had nothing to do with anything Jimmy, Stevie, and I was doing. For him, it was a guilt by association. I think my chair is going down again. I'm losing gas, I guess. uh, uh, Eventually, he pleaded guilty in October of 2000 to a superseding indictment charging him with racketeering, extortion, and money laundering. He was sentenced in September 2004 to a year and a day in prison. He also had to pay a $10,000 fine and $25,000 in restitution to Ray Slinger, the guy who lied about the body bag. A couple of years later, or years earlier, I had spent a weekend in jail. So this wasn't my first time in jail. I wasn't that concerned about what they had on me. When I carefully read the indictment, which included racketeering, extortion, money laundering, conspiracy to distribute drugs, and 2 charges of using a firearm in commission of a crime, I knew half the charges were bullshit ones that I could beat, and then a lot of them were repetitive. That night, Kevin O'Neill and I were taken to the state police barracks at Logan Airport, where they locked us up in separate cells. There was no need to call my family. People who knew I had been arrested had certainly called them. Had certainly called them already. The next day, on November 18th, I was taken to the federal court in Boston, where I was arraigned. Then Kevin and I, along with some other prisoners, were put in a van and driven to Wyatt Federal Prison, a federal holding facility in Rhode Island. The feds didn't want me in Plymouth because that's where Stevie was. Once we got to Wyatt, we got processed and put in a cell block. I made my first call to my sister, who told me my mother had just died that day, and I had known she was sick, but I hadn't thought she was near death. 2 days later, on November 20th, I was picked up in Rhode Island and driven to the wake at O'Brien Funeral Home in South Boston. I was shackled and handcuffed as the marshals led me inside. They had already blocked off traffic so no one else could drive into the street. I was alone with the casket for about 10 minutes with the marshals right beside me, along with Jackie O'Brien, the funeral home director. Then I was led back to the car and driven back to Rhode Island. Here I was in a 5-man cell with 2 guys from the Dominican Republic, one from Colombia and another from Venezuela. They were all very respectful and kept asking if there was anything they could do for me. That night, I rolled over and went to sleep, but I didn't sleep great. The next day, I was brought to a bail hearing at the federal courthouse in Boston, where I was bound over without bail. Whenever I went into Boston for a hearing, I was awakened at 4 a.m. and driven up to the courthouse, where I would sit in a holding cell until my turn before it was my turn before the magistrate. Then I would be driven back the same day, back in Rhode Island. I had visits from my brothers and my wife Pam. A couple of weeks after I was arrested, my lawyer got me a copy of Judge Wolf's 661-page ruling that he had released on September 15th. It was a shock to see everything there, to see exactly what Jimmy and Stevie had been doing over the years. I'd seen Connolly's reports that he had written on Jimmy and Stevie, but I hadn't known exactly how many years those guys had been informants for. Since Stevie since 65 and Jimmy since 1975. One day after a visit in Wyatt, I was walking downstairs waiting to be brought out of the visiting room when an inmate asked me, "Are you Kevin Weeks?" "Yeah," I told him. He had introduced himself, and then I knew he was a made guy from Rhode Island. "Kid, what are you doing?" he asked me. "Are you going to take it up the ass for these guys? Remember, you can't rat on a rat. Those guys have been giving up everyone for 30 years. At the time, I was still thinking things over. At 43, I was looking to make a plea for 15 years. Later on, my attorney, Richie Egbert, came up to me to see me. "Hi, Richie. How you doing?" I said as we shook hands and went into the little room where lawyers can visit their clients. Right away, he said, "Kev, I don't know what to tell you." "Well, how does it look, Richie?" "Not good," he said. "We can beat half these charges, but every charge they find you guilty on, they're going to give you the max. They're so mad at the other two, at Whitey and Stevie, and with Whitey gone, they're going to look to give you the max on whatever they can, the maximum sentence." "What are you talking about?" I asked him. "How many years, Richie?" You don't want to know," he said. "Just tell me, Richie," I said. "What are we talking about? For years?" "You're gone," he said. "It's over. If I was you, I'd do some thinking. I'm not telling you what to do, but it's over." Then he informed me he might have a conflict of interest with another client who was involved in the case, and he wasn't sure he could represent me. Soon after that, I met with another attorney, Charlie Rankin, who came up to Wyatt on a Friday, and we sat around for a while and talked about the case. He basically told me the same thing Richie had said. On every charge, they would give me the maximum. For me to represent you, by Monday, you'll have to give me $120,000 for the bail hearing, he told me, and then it will be $20,000 a week for the case, and you'll pay all expenses for transcripts and appeals for everything like that. Right then, I was thinking, he's talking appeals. This guy thinks we're going to lose. He's long. How long will the trial last? I asked him. 4 to 6 months, he told me. So you're talking around $600,000, I said. For that, what are you guaranteeing me? No guarantees, he told me. What about time? I said. I'm going to give you $600,000 and you can't even tell me what to expect out of this. No guarantees, he said again. That Monday, they brought me into Boston to the bail hearing at the federal courthouse. When I was sitting in my holding cell, I looked over and caught a glimpse of Bobby DeLuca, dressed nicely in a suit, sitting in the cell next to me. Bobby was one of the original people who got indicted in 1995, along with Jimmy and Stevie and Frankie Salemi and Jimmy and Johnny Mortiano. He was Stevie's co-defendant in the case. I had gotten to know him when I was visiting Stevie at Plymouth and had always found him to be a real nice and honorable person. Out of everybody who got indicted at that time, he was one of the only ones who didn't cooperate. He went and did his time. That day he was pleading out guilty and getting sentenced, taking a 10-year sentence on top of the 5 he had already had. Anyhow, while we were in adjacent cells, he called out, "How you doing?" And the two of us shook hands through the bars. We couldn't see each other well, but we talked for a couple of hours. Right away, Bobby said, "Stevie is a selfish bastard. He don't give a shit about anybody but himself. That day he mentioned your name in court. We all told him, 'What the fuck are you doing mentioning Kevin's name?' He's the only guy out there helping you, and you just put a bullseye on his back. As it turned out that day, my bail hearing got postponed, so nothing happened, and I was brought back to Wyatt. Charlie Rankin later informed me that he was going to put the bail hearing off. I did receive some good news, however, when I learned that my case and bail hearing had been assigned to Judge Harrington, that pleased me because I knew the judge was good friends with John Connolly and Jimmy knew him. If I had a shot with any judge, he was it. When I was in the courtroom that day, along with Kevin O'Neill, waiting for Judge Harrington to enter, Tom Duffy and Steve Johnson from the state police served me a piece of paper. I noticed that the agents all had smiles on their faces when I was given the paper. I looked at it and read that Judge Harrington had recused himself. Back at Wyatt a few days later, I received a letter from Stevie. The last time I had seen him was during my last visit to Plymouth, the end of October or beginning of November 1999. He had sent the letter to the family member of mine who had forwarded it to me. At the bottom of the handwritten note, Stevie had written, "My case is going good, and good luck with yours." In other words, you're on your own. I don't expect anything from him, but I hadn't expected that. He had certainly chosen his words poorly. In the meantime, there was news that about Johnny Martirano, who had been in Plymouth with Stevie and Salemi and Bobby DeLuca as co-defendants in the case. It had been advantageous to have both Johnny and Stevie in Plymouth so they could go over everything about their case, which they had been planning to fight together. But everything changed after Johnny learned what Jimmy and Stevie had been doing, which was probably a little before I heard about it on television. After that, Johnny had weighed his options. One option had been to kill Stevie right there in the cell block, which he was certainly both mad enough and capable enough to do easily. Another option was to cooperate. I bet it was a hard choice, but Johnny came to the same decision I eventually did. What am I protecting them for? These two have been giving everyone up right along, but am I going to do? What am I going to do? Go to prison for life just to be able to say I am a stand-up guy? Johnny ended up cooperating, admitting he killed 20 people and implicating Jimmy and Stevie in multiple murders in exchange for 14-year sentence. Although I had only met Johnny Martirano a few times, I'd been brought up on the stories about him during the gang wars of the 1960s and 70s up through the early 1980s. All I knew is that if you were going to go after Johnny Martirano, you'd better be in a tank. Now, here was this guy who was a legend in Boston who had been involved in 20 murders with Jimmy and Stevie, and he had decided to cooperate against them. A few years later, in June of 2004, I ended up writing a letter to the Judge Wolf on Johnny's behalf before his sentencing, explaining that When a man of Johnny's stature decided to cooperate against Jimmy and Stevie, it made my choice a lot easier. After the life I led, trying to tell right from wrong, good guys from bad guys, was very confusing. Then I realized that Johnny Marti Martorano seemed to know what to do. If it was right for him, then it was right for me. But when I was still trying to decide what to do for myself, I learned that Frankie Salami was trying to make a deal. I did a lot of thinking and talking it over with my family. I also spoke to Kevin O'Neill, who also ended up cooperating. Listen, I'm gone, I told Kevin. It's over, and we don't owe them a thing, he said. By later, December 1999, I had decided to make a deal to cooperate. In January 2000, I was brought up to Boston for an interview. By then, the government had appointed a new lawyer, Dennis Kelly, who was very articulate and knowledgeable. He'd been a federal prosecutor and knew his way around the federal system. We talked about some of the crimes I might or might not have been involved with, and if maybe we might be able to find some bodies. At the second meeting, the agents and prosecutors said that before they made a deal with me, they wanted me, as an act of good faith, to go out and recover some of those bodies. At the time, I didn't have any plea agreement or anything, but Dennis told me I should do it. If I give these people these bodies, I told him, they could use these bodies against me. I have nothing to sign now. Kevin Dennis told me they have dealt with people before who have lied and double crossed them. This time they want to make sure you can deliver what you are telling them before they make a deal with you. So on January 13th, 2000, I showed three body, them three bodies. That day, I had them bring me back to the place where 15 years earlier on Halloween night, Jimmy, Stevie, and I had reburied Barrett, Johnny McIntyre, and Deborah Hussey. When we got there that cold January day, the snow covered area was being prepared for a building for a credit union of some sort, and all the landmarks were gone. The woods and the bushes were bulldozed down, and everything was barren around where they were going to put the new building. I laid down in the snow just as I had done when I had been lying on the same spot with the machine gun in 1985. I figured out from the angle of the front door of Florian Hall the exact same spot a few feet away where Jimmy, Stevie, and I had put the bodies. After I told law enforcement where to dig, I was driven back to my cell in Rockingham County, New Hampshire, where I had been transferred from Rhode Island a short time earlier. That night, I was looking out. Uh, I was looking out my cell window at the TV in the common area, and all of a sudden I saw my picture on the news. They showed scenes of agents recovering the bodies. I went and sat down on my bunk, and said to myself, what the fuck have I done? About an hour later, the guards took me out of my cell to the payphone. Tom Duffy from the state police was on the phone. Kevin, he said. Yeah, I answered. You hit the ball out of the park, he said. What do you mean? I asked. We went down with the backhoe to exactly where you had said the bodies would be, he told me, and that's exactly where they were. Now we believe you. Now we can talk. The next day when the door opened and I came out of my cell, not one person said a word to me except, "Hey, how you doing?" And they had all seen it on TV. The night before, I'd figured I was going to have a problem when I came out of my cell because it was all over the news that I was cooperating. But it turned out that there was no problem at all. Over the course of time, now that my credibility had been established, agents and investigators from all over the country kept calling and interviewing me. I met with agents from the Joint Task Force, Violent Fugitive Task Force, DEA, State Police, IRS, and Justice Department, along with investigators from Oklahoma and Dade County, Florida. Initially, they didn't want the FBI included because of corruption considerations, but when the Justice Department got involved, they brought in FBI agents, not from Boston, but from out of state. Now that they had the bodies, the agents and investigators wanted to know how they got killed and exactly what crimes I was involved in. I was kept in Rockingham County Jail in New Hampshire from January 2000 to April of 2000. In April, they moved me to Stafford County, New Hampshire, where I stayed until September 21st. On that day, I was moved to Allenwood, Pennsylvania, where I would serve the remainder of my sentence. In the beginning, I was brought to the federal courthouse in Boston and Worcester for interviews and then returned to my cell in New Hampshire. From January 2000 until July of that year, I was taken down at least once a month to be interviewed. And when I left for Allenwood, I continued to be interviewed, sometimes being brought back to Boston, but most times I had agents coming down there to see me. The deal I would be offered would be based on whatever information I gave. While my court appointed lawyer, Dennis Kelly, was there for the initial meeting, he did not accompany me to my interviews. The investigator wanted to know my criminal history. Of course, I had no notes and everything I had done was in my head. The agents were always professional, writing down everything I said. People on the streets might have thought I ratted about anything and everything, but the focus was on Jimmy and Stevie and their connections in law enforcement. All I talked about were the crimes I was involved in. The police asked me about a lot of other murders, and I'd say they might have occurred, but I wasn't there. I didn't hurt anyone who was still out on the street. All I could tell the agents was what I, not anyone else, was involved in. Dan Doherty from the DEA and Steve Johnson from the Massachusetts State Police were the agents in charge of me the whole time. Always respectful, professional, and businesslike. They never lied about the sentencing and never made any promises or anything. Although I did not know what was ultimately going to happen, we talked about crimes and things they hadn't heard. Most often they had heard different stories, but I said, no, this is what happened. I'm not going to lie or embellish. They listened, and the only comments they made to me was, Kev, it is what it is. Several agents commented that my stories never changed. Here we go. That's because I was there to tell the truth. And the good thing about telling the truth is that your story never changes. You don't have to remember what you said to one person or the next. It's when you make up one lie that they can tear you apart. At that point in my life, it was either the truth or nothing. In July 2000, I received 3 letters of immunity from Suffolk County, Massachusetts, Dade County, Florida, and Tulsa, Oklahoma. I wasn't involved in the murders in Tulsa, Oklahoma, or Dade County, or Florida, but I wanted to be sure that I couldn't be held culpable in those crimes after the fact. Once I had my immunity taken care of, I was able to work on my plea agreement, which took 7 months to negotiate. They ended up adding 5 murders to my charges on the superseding indictment. When I was initially indicted in November of '99, my offense level came in at level 43. Your offense goes from 0 to 43, while your criminal history level goes from 0 to 6. The more arrests and convictions you have, the higher your criminal history level. When my additional charges came in, I was enhanced 1 point for each murder, including Bucky Barrett, John McIntyre, Deborah Hussey, Brian Halloran, and Michael Donahue, with a total of 5 points, and 4 more points for managerial position, which brought it to 43 to level 52. But because of my plea agreement, my offense level was brought back to level 43. Still, it was overkill. Level 43 is as high as the guidelines go. Even though your level can be enhanced a few more points, but anyway, you look at it, I was facing life imprisonment. The agent kept on interviewing me, and in October of 2000, I led them to 3 more bodies. I knew where one was, but as for the other 2, I told them I had only a 50-50 chance of finding them. The 50-50 chance referred to the location, which was the spot Jimmy used to look at with his binoculars from his bay window. I had been around him so long that I knew him well enough to understand he was only looking at that spot for 2 reasons. He was either looking for a place to put somebody, or he was looking at a place where somebody was already buried. As it turned out, somebody was already buried there. Tommy King. Johnny Martirano had killed Tommy's in Jimmy's car in '75 after Tommy and Jimmy had words at Triple O's, but Tommy King was buried in a marshy area, one of the guys kept saying. Tommy King got killed up the street, I told him. And if you walk over there, you'll see the marshy area. There's a 50-50 chance he'll be there. 2 weeks later, they found his body. A few weeks beforehand, they found Tommy King. They found Polly McGonigal. That location I had no problem with, since Jimmy had told me Polly was buried on Tennecan Beach in Dorchester. The third body was Deborah Davis. They had info that she was near Tommy King's body, so they give me credit for discovering her body too. But she had been buried at low tide, so they had to wait for the tide to go out before they could find her along the Neponset River a few weeks after they found Tommy. Even though Davis's family and the family lawyer had been informed that I had no involvement in Deborah's death. They had never met her, or that I had never met her, and if it wasn't for me, her remains would never have been found. The family lawyer still came after me civilly. They were trying to blame me for her murder, even though they knew I had nothing to do with it, and sued me for wrongful death. Like everything, it all comes down to money. That's all they wanted. As of the writing of this book, the suit has been stayed by my bankruptcy case. The only arguments the agents and I ever had in the entire process of my cooperation concerned Stippo. Basically, there was one agent who believed Stippo and what he had to say, while the rest of the agents disagreed with him. Those agents had their doubts about Stippo all along. He went back and forth about the true facts of what happened, excuse me, and everything I had told them, my chair, and what his family had told him. Finally, the agent said, Kevin is admitting to murder and to extortion and to crimes far exceeding this one. Why would he be arguing about the circumstances of this crime when he pled guilty to more severe crimes? Subsequently, based on their investigation and what his family and others said, everything was ultimately corroborated and the situation resolved itself. Stippo had lied. When I gave up information in 2000, the state police had suspected but didn't know any of the specific details. They knew details but based on eyewitness accounts. But they didn't know the inside stories about the Halloran murder or the weapons arsenal. They hadn't known of my involvement in these crimes, but still, they never reacted when I relayed them or related my accounts. This was the first time since I was a kid that I didn't have control over my own life. I had reached a point where my freedom was in other people's hands, in these agents' hands. But during all that time, I never caught them in a lie and was never lied to about anything. It was obvious they all had a hate thing for Stevie, with that, or with they detested so much were the women. Stevie had killed a lot of people, but it was the deaths of his girlfriend and his stepdaughter that made him so hated. As for me, I didn't need anyone to hold my hand. I had gotten into it this myself. From me, the investigators wanted the connection to the FBI and the state police. They wanted Jimmy and Stevie, and the only ones on a large scale who I was involved with, along with Schneiderhan and Connolly, who had become a focus of the investigation before I was arrested. For these investigators, it was the first time they had someone directly involved in all these crimes and the workings of the organization provide testimony. And I continued to give them every crime I had been involved in over the course of 25 years, every single one. The shootings, stabbings, extortions, murders, my involvement with drugs, with loan sharking, with gambling, with everything. Before I had been arrested, when I was still on the street, the police had once come to me, given me my rights, and advised me I was the prime suspect in 3 other murders. Now people were still trying unsuccessfully to make a case in those 3 murders. The only thing I never did during all my testimony was lie. If I had been caught in even one lie, my credibility would have been gone. My deal would have been gone, and I would have ended up with a life sentence. All I needed to do was to tell them exactly what had happened. This was basically the best thing I ever did because now the investigators knew the answers to all their questions. All I knew, the information they had received based on their informants. When I was being debriefed, I was given a list of 163 names who were allegedly informants or were allegedly cooperating with law enforcement, and was asked if I recognized any of those names. I did recognize some of them. I knew about the street people who were already arrested, the people who were charged in other crimes, those who made deals to save their own asses, those who had already given me up. There are people who are on the street now who are walking around like they are stand up guys, but in fact, I know who they are and what they said. They can fool people around them, but they can't fool me. I know exactly what was said and what was done and who they are. In May 2002, I was driven to Boston from Alameda for a few days of testimony in John Connolly's trial for giving the tip off of the indictments coming down that led to Jimmy's fleeing. He'd been named in a 5-count federal indictment a month after I was arrested, including falsifying reports about Stevie and Jimmy and funneling $7,000 in payoffs from them to John Morris. He'd been indicted just as the 5 statute of limitations on the tip off to Jimmy in December of '94 was about to run out. I stayed in a cell at the courthouse for the 3 days that I was in Boston. During that time, I didn't speak to any lawyers or investigators about the case. No one coached me or told me what to say. I had already been interviewed about Connolly over the course of time. There was no need for me to try to remember any particular details. All I had to do was tell the truth. The 2 days in the courtroom, there were no surprises for me. I just told them exactly what happened. Each day I saw Conley, and as far as I was concerned, he was looking out for himself, as was everybody else. He ended up being convicted of racketeering and sentenced to 10 years and 1 month. 3 years later in Florida, he was indicted for first-degree murder and conspiracy for allegedly providing information that prosecutors said led to John Callahan's death. I was also brought back to Boston for Schneiderhan's and Michael Fleming's trial. Sometimes I was driven up and other times I was flown there. Schneiderhan was convicted in March 2003 of trying to warn Billy Bulger that his phone was tapped. 6 months later, he was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison for obstruction of justice. Michael Fleming had been arrested in 2000 and charged with obstruction of justice and perjury, possession of unregistered weapons, and transfer and possession of machine guns for helping to move the arsenal of weapons from the shed in his parents' backyard. In 2002, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Finally, in October 2003, Stevie, then 69, cooperated with authorities and pled to 10 murders in exchange for a recommended sentence of life in prison to avoid the death penalty for the two murders, one in Florida and the other in Oklahoma. If Stevie rendered substantial assistance about his own criminal activity and others in a timely fashion, his brother Michael could possibly receive a reduction in his sentence. One of Stevie's sons, Bill Hussey, changed his name to William Sr. Croy. I think that was a grandparent's name. He testified against his own uncle, Michael Flemmy, and then, when faced with the possibility of charges against himself, was prepared to testify against his own father. When Stevie pled out, his son did not have to testify against him. Most of the time, however, the same people I had been with before, the prosecutors, U.S. attorney agents, and members of the Department of Justice task force, came to Allenwood to talk to me. I continued to meet with all of them until Stevie pled out guilty to 10 murders. During one of the flights that I took between Boston and Pennsylvania, the federal marshals brought me to the airport handcuffed and shackled. Of course, the chains limit your movements. You can't scratch your nose or go to the men's room alone. But when the federal marshals marched me on the plane, the flight attendant met us at the door and said, "You can't bring him on like that." The federal marshals were a little upset and tried to object to removing my shackles and handcuffs, but in the end, they had to do it. So they said, "Kevin, do you promise you won't do anything?" "Yeah," I said. And they removed the handcuffs, waist chains, and shackles. I walked to my seat and went to sleep. On March 22nd, 2004, in Boston Federal Court, U.S. District Court Judge Richard Stearns sentenced me. When I walked into the courtroom, I had no idea what he would give me. All I knew was that it could be anywhere from 5 to 20 years. U.S. Attorney Michael Sullivan wanted me to do 15 years and considered my sentence one of the most distasteful things he had to do. But he did state that you have to deal with violent criminals to get more violent criminals. However, the agents who had been involved with me all the time, along with U.S. Attorney Brian Kelly, who prosecuted me, and Fred Weishak, who had worked with me, believed, based on my cooperation, that I deserved less than 15 years. Kelly and Weishak spoke on my behalf and kept their word to me, as did agents Steve Johnson and Dan Doherty. That day, at least 20 agents and prosecutors from Washington and Connecticut and other states came in on my behalf. In the courtroom, they stated that my cooperation was unprecedented, unparalleled in Massachusetts history. All along, they had not promised me anything except that when it came to my sentencing, they would do their best for me. They all kept their word. John Dunham from the Justice Department Strike Force, who had prosecuted the case against John Connolly and Richard Schneiderhan, along with Lenny Boyle, another prosecutor, also spoke on my behalf, stating that my cooperation was extraordinary. There was no victim impact statement, but the lawyer for Michael Donahue's two sons tried to bring up the civil suit. Judge Stearns said that his courtroom wasn't the venue for that case, which would be settled in another court by another judge. He cited that I had given up 3 bodies with no agreement in place, with no safety net, and charged with those crimes, I had put myself at peril and placed my faith in the justice system. He also cited that he had seen me testify, that I was very candid and truthful, and that I hadn't hesitated to answer any questions posed to me. I was expected I was expecting the worst, but in the end the judge gave me 72 months, including time served. He spoke to me then, saying, Mr. Weeks, good luck, and I hope I've done the right thing. He also said that the sentence was one of the most difficult that I have faced as a judge. The whole procedure took about 25 minutes. I spent that night in a holding cell at the courthouse and was driven back to Allenwood the next day. Since they give you 54 days for good behavior, you usually end up doing 85% of your time. I ended up serving a total of 73 months. At Allenwood, I had been put in prison inside a prison, in a prison inside a prison. In the federal inmate witness protection program called WITSEC, a high security unit for people who were cooperating on cases. Gerald Schur, a federal marshal, was, and one of the original founders of WITSEC program in '67, was quoted as saying in front of Congress that doing 1 day in WITSEC was equivalent to doing 3 days in regular prison. That's because WITSEC, was more confined and there was less to do in it. It housed approximately 70 prisoners, a lot of them involved in high-profile cases, from mafia underbosses, hint, hint, that's probably Sammy, uh, down to gangbangers from the Crips and the Bloods. In our unit, we had Nazi lowriders, dirty white boys, Latin kings, and traditional organized crime Irish and Italian guys. Occasionally there were fistfights, but wasn't like being in a regular federal prison, in the sense that the chances for violent confrontation were a lot less. Things never really got out of control. 95% of the guys who were in there had a chance to get out and at some time in their lives, while the other 5% were doing life bids and were never getting out. But if guys got into too many fights, they did get thrown out of the WITSEC unit. While I was there, 3 guys were thrown out. These guys ended up in segregated prison units where they are locked down 24 hours a day, except for 3 times a week when they were let out for exercise. While I was there, I had a couple of workout partners, one from Massachusetts and one from Philly, who were real nice guys. Even though you always refer to each other by your first name and last initial, eventually you got to know everybody's name as well as their background and case. The workout partner I was the closest to was Billy N, who was called the hater by the staff because he didn't associate with a lot of people. He'd been in prison a long time and he could figure out and read people very well. My second workout partner, Tommy R., used to cook using the couple of microwaves inside the unit, and the three of us would eat together. I was also close to a few other people in, in there, guys I would consider friends, fellows from Philly, along with some blacks from DC and New York, and some Spanish guys from Mexico and New York. People ran in different circles, and I didn't get along with everyone in there. There were a lot of people who you just ignored. They didn't want to be around you, and you didn't want to be around them. While I was there, I read a lot, which was one of the best things you can do. I received 4 or 5 books a week from my brother's books by Lee Child. That's like Jack Reacher novels. Stuart Woods, Lawrence Block, Jack Higgins, um, Tess Gerritsen, James Patterson, and Stephen Ambrose. I'd read them as soon as they arrived and pass them on to other inmates when I finished them. I exercised 5 days a week, lifting weights in the weight room from 9:30 till 10:45 in the morning, and on weekends I'd work out with pull-up bar outside. At night at 6, I'd run on the treadmill for an hour, 7 nights a week. The rest of the time I'd read. Basically, my 4 years and 5 months at Allenwood were uneventful. I just read a lot and worked out and ran. Time passed pretty quickly as long as you stayed busy. The only thing about being in these WITSEC units was that they didn't have the facilities other prisons had. All they had was a very small yard and no outdoor activities to speak of. There wasn't much for the inmates to do besides reading, working out, and watching TV. No education was available except for the inmates who were required to get their GED. Since it was too great a security risk to bring in teachers, there were no college courses, no computer classes, no teachers whatsoever. Anytime anyone from outside came in to do work, they would put us back in the unit and lock us down. The one big thing that you did have in WITSEC unit, and which compensated for everything you didn't have, was that eventually, based on seniority, you got a single cell. It took me 2.5 years, but I did get my own cell along with a TV. We were allowed 300 minutes a month of phone calls, which was equivalent to 25 minutes phone calls. In a prison, no one can call you, so you make all the calls. Basically, in WICSEC, you are isolated from everybody. They allow a small list of visitors who, who have to get clearance from Washington to be on your visiting list. At the beginning, I had visitors, but then I told people not to come. Even my lawyer never came up. I felt it was too long a trip for my family to drive more than 7 hours each way just for a visit, but I talked to family and friends once a week. I kept in touch with some good friends on the street who stayed loyal to me, including some people I was involved with when I was out there. They all they all understood that after it came out that Jimmy and Stevie were informants, nobody would blame me for anyone else involved in the case for cooperating. There were two staff members who would go out of their way to help inmates out. Mr. Stork, who would help an inmate with whatever job he had, while Mr. Fink was the type of guy who would joke with the inmates all day long to keep it lighthearted. As long as everything ran smoothly, the unit manager, Mr. Moyer, didn't go out of his way to hassle the inmates. There were a few guards, but not many, who would go out of their way to give you a hard time. One of my two workout partners and closest friends is still in there. He received a 13-year sentence and still had 6 more to do. My other workout partner was getting out a month or two after me. After my release, there were restrictions on my associations and travel, and I had 5 years of supervised release, which means I can't travel outside the district without permission or associate with any known felons. Now that I'm out, my life is very quiet with no stress. Coming back, it was strange being around people and adjusting to the freedom of walking into a store and buying something to eat or some clothes. For myself in prison, you're wearing khakis, prison issued clothes all the time. When I first got out and came back, I saw that a lot had changed, including the whole dynamics of the city. I don't live in Boston anymore, but I did go back to South Boston and saw family and friends and the people I was involved with. They all understood that I hadn't hurt anyone on the street. To the person, they all came up to me, shook my hands, hugged me, and said, "Whatever we can help you with, we will." The government never gave me any money or anything, so I had to start all over from scratch, except for the support of these friends and family. The only thing the government did do for me was to keep its word and give me back my life back. On February 4th, 2005, my oldest brother, Billy, drove to um, Allenwood to bring me home. It was a beautiful winter day. We left at 8 in the morning and got to Massachusetts at 3 in the afternoon. When we got to Billy's house, I didn't want a beer or a steak dinner. All I wanted was to go for a walk someplace where there were no walls. I got out of the car and went by myself for a long walk. That's it. Page 278. That's the final chapter. So I'm going to just finish this other little short bit here. And it says, "Where are they now?" Steve Flemmy pled out to 10 murders in February 2004 and was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. John Connolly, convicted in 2002 of 1 count of racketeering, 2 counts of obstruction of justice, and 1 count of making a false statement to the FBI, and sentenced to 121 months, now facing first-degree murder and conspiracy charges in Florida for allegedly providing information that led to the death of former World Highlight President John Callahan. Johnny Martirano, sentenced to 14 years in 2004. He'll be out with time served in 2007. He only had to do, wow, 3 years. That's not much. Richie Schneiderhan, sentenced to 18 months in 2000 for obstruction of justice and conspiracy. Former FBI agent Paul Rico died in an Oklahoma jail in January 2004 at the age of 78 while awaiting trial for Roger Wheeler's murder. Former FBI agent John Morris retired from the FBI. Kevin O'Neill home with his family after he did 11 months for racketeering, extortion, and money laundering, back working in developing and selling real estate. Frank Salemi got out before he was rearrested on an obstruction of justice charge in November of 2004. Jim Bulger, still fine and soaking up the sun. Kevin Weeks, happy to have a second chance in life. Wow, that's it, eh? So that's the book. There are some acknowledgments here, but I'm not going to read the acknowledgments. That was an excellent read. Large print in the hardcover novel or form. If anybody knows Kevin Weeks, I'd be willing to interview him, and I do it on StreamYard, of course. Like, I've got a StreamYard account now. I've been doing everything on this just off of YouTube, but that would be kind of cool to do. So I really feel like I persevered. I don't know how. I kind of wanted to have a little conversation about reading, if anybody wanted to talk about reading. I know some people have a hard time reading. Some people don't even know how to read. And sometimes people have a hard time even finishing a book. And it does take commitment to read. I also found it very difficult to read a book aloud. You stumble over your words. You put words that aren't even there. You can get stumbled up and fouled so easily reading sentences, especially as you get a little fatigued in reading. But it was a challenge, and I'm proud that I finished this 14-part series. You know, it actually, I kind of thought I fucked it up a little there with the one day there I read a couple short chapters, but it ended up working nice. So yeah, that's the 14-part series. If you're watching there now and you want to jump in the chat, go ahead. Say hi. There's another guy, I'm looking at his book to read. He's on YouTube. I think his name's like Frank or Jimmy or something like that. He's kind of a cool guy. He's got some hella stories and a book. And I thought that would be interesting to read his book. I left him a comment there, and we'll see. Maybe I'll get to interview him. So that's Kevin Weeks's book. And like I said, if anybody knows him and he wants to come on, and I could ask him a ton of questions. I've never seen the guy interviewed in all these years now. It's all over YouTube, but from back in the day, maybe he's like really like gone underground, but that would be a neat thing to do. So without further ado, I give this book on a scale of 5. I would give it a 5, man. 5-star. It was excellent. You know, I found a lot too. Like, I like to read about, or I like to watch a lot of videos about Whitey Bulger and all the related stories and crimes. Well, in Kevin's books there, as I read, he gives his outtake, especially about the one guy with the liquor store and the wife. That's one of the famous ones. And to this day, when you see it, you think that, oh yeah, they shook this guy down. And in reality, the guy wanted to sell the store, but he tried to get more money out of the guys for the sale of it, and lied to his wife, the whole bit. So, and his brother. But okay, so that's my 14-part series of Kevin Weeks's book, Brutal. The untold story is now told of Kevin Weeks' life inside Whitey Bulger's Irish mob. I'll see you in the next video, and I'll be reading Jay Dobbin's No Angel. You don't want to miss that one, because I've already read it, and it's a gooder. Okay, I'm out.